we put all of the information we've learned together and talk about climates and generalizations about climates in different parts of the world, that leads us to climate zones. And there's a number of different ways to categorize climate zones. A very popular one is the Köppen climate zones, and the 6 primary categories are listed here. There's tropical, dry, moist subtropics, mid-latitudes, the moist continental mid-latitudes, polar, and then highlands, which sometimes are referred to as alpine regions. And so then within these, there are all these further divisions, subdivisions, within each of these primary categories. Because you might have a polar region, but within that, some polar regions are more dry and some are more wet, depending on where they are and which way the rain is, the precipitation goes. Mostly it's snow in the polar regions. What I want to point out here is not for anyone to memorize all of these primary categories and subcategories. Really, that's not the goal. The goal here is to just notice patterns. And so if you look at the 0-degree latitude line across Earth, you'll notice there's a lot of green subcategories with the A as the first letter for their category. So these are all the tropics. So the tropical regions tend to be right around the equator, from 0 to about 20 degrees north or south. When you get outside of that region, that's when you start to see the moist subtropics, so C's, okay, and then also B for dry desert areas. And so that's because we had all this moisture that was falling here, and then as this air descends and it's lost all the moisture, it's going to be drier. As we move up away from the equator, we start to see more brown on our map, and we start to see a lot of D's. So D is that moist continental mid-latitude region, okay? And so that area is going to be moist, but it does get cold there in the winter. So it is different from the southern sea regions, which tend to be warmer in the winter and have more rainfall in the winter. And then the pink in the map, so the pink is only in the polar regions, and of course that's a polar type environment. And then we also have highlands. Okay, so highlands are really hard to see on this map, but a highland is basically, there's going to be some highlands along the Sierra Nevadas in the United States, in Nepal, in this area with the white, there's going to be highlands. So anywhere where you have very high altitudes, you have a very specific climate area. So that's the trends. This is just a summary of what we saw on the map, and to describe each climate category a little more in depth. So we saw the tropics were right around the latitudes from 0 to 20 degrees north or south of the equator. They're always warm year-round, so average temperatures are more than 64 degrees Fahrenheit or 18 degrees Celsius year-round. They don't really have winter as we think of winter. And they get a lot of rain, so they tend to get more than 59 inches of rain. So some areas in the world that are considered tropical would be Central America. If we look at dry climates, those tend to be areas where the evaporation and transpiration from plants can sometimes, during certain parts of the year, it can exceed precipitation, and so they tend to be very dry. That's in that mid-latitude region, 20 to 35 degrees north or south of the equator. And also these tend to be inside large continental regions surrounded by mountains, and so they're experiencing a rain shadow effect where they're kind of cut off from large bodies of water that would supply moisture. That includes areas like in the United States, Arizona, Nevada, and California's Death Valley. Two other moist climates are the moist subtropical mid-latitudes and then the moist continental mid-latitudes. The only thing that separates these from one another is that the subtropicals tend to be along the coasts, so that's the east and west coasts. So you can think of like the Carolinas maybe. And then the moist continental mid-latitudes, those are inland, so the middle of the country. And what separates these is that if you're on the coastal regions, you're going to have more moisture, and you're also not going to have as many extreme temperatures. And so when you're talking about these moist continental mid-latitudes, they tend to get warmer in the summer and colder in the winter than the moist subtropical mid-latitudes, which are moderated by the coast, which keeps them from getting too hot or cold. The polar regions, you can probably guess, are the regions that are 66 degrees north and or south of the equator, and so that's those polar parts of the globe. They are cold year-round. In the warmest month, they're still less than 50 degrees Fahrenheit or less than 10 degrees Celsius. And these include northern coasts of North America, so Alaska and Canada, northern coast of Europe and Asia, and then the continents and large land masses of Greenland and Antarctica. And then the last one we talked about when we were looking at that map was the Highlands. Some people refer to this as alpine regions, but the official name, according to the Köppen climate zones, is Highlands. This is really unique. So these are isolated areas that are at very high elevations, and they're also experiencing sharp changes in climate. So as you travel up a slope, then the climate changes very quickly from one type to another, and is very extreme. This would include parts of like Sierra Nevada mountains in the United States, the Tibet Plateau, so that's very, very high, and there's a lot of mountains in that area that are very, very high, and so those are going to have their own unique little climate areas as you travel up the mountains.